I'm not a scientist, so I don't have any big scientific thing to share with you. But when I was a Trappist monk, especially at the Abbey of Gethsemane, and some bit also at Mepkin Abbey in South Carolina, I was involved in a lot of interreligious dialogue, and especially with Tibetan monks often. We would have a lot of dialogue. The Dalai Lama came sometimes and was involved in this, and it was very interesting. There were some books that came out of it. And it was a kind of comparative religious, sort of different religions comparing notes, basically. And really early on in my monastic life, I got very involved in Buddhist practice and went very deeply into the Southeast Asian Theravadan style of Buddhism. Had a teacher, Bhante Honapala Gunaratana, who was one of my great masters, and I still have much respect for him. He's quite elderly now. And I even ordained for a year and a half in the Theravadan tradition in order to get the training, the monastic training of it, and to go deeply into Vipassana and metta practice, which I still practice metta practice, which is sending out loving kindness, and teach it in some of my retreats. And the thing that always struck me in this interreligious dialogue that went on, that I was involved with, that I had the honor to be involved with, was how you could have different diverse religions. And Mirabai Starr was talking about this a little bit today, about the trans-spiritual, kind of movement that's going on, how there's really this sense that all the religions in their essence, at their heart, have the same heart, really. You know, they might have different practices, they have different terminologies and theologies and mythologies and cosmologies and all kinds of ologies, but at their heart, they're pointing to the same reality, which is God or consciousness or just life. You could call it any of the above or none of the above. It doesn't care what you call it. But what always struck me as so interesting was how you could have these religions that developed on absolute opposite ends of the globe, and yet you could find parallels. You could find all these amazing parallels in practice, in concept, in realization, that really were very, at their heart, seemingly the same kind of thing. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. There was a practice that I was introduced to very early in my monastic life and in my formation. There was a whole movement in the Trappist order, and it's worldwide now. It's promulgated by an organization called Contemplative Outreach, which was founded by Father Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington, and William Menninger. They were monks of Spencer Abbey, St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. And it's called centering prayer. And centering prayer, very few people know the origins of centering prayer, but the origins of centering prayer are found in a 14th century Christian mystical classic work known as the Cloud of Unknowing. And the Cloud of Unknowing was written by an anonymous English author. We really don't know who wrote it. There's conjecture that it could have been possibly a Carthusian, because the Carthusian monks is the strictest order in the church. A lot of people think the Trappists are the strictest, but the Carthusians knocked us out of the water. They were hermits. They hardly ever spoke. They lived in solitude all the time. They were pretty ascetical, had all kinds of very strict fasting. And they live a completely anonymous life. Even if they publish a book, it never has their name on it. It always says, by a Carthusian monk. And even when they die, they're buried under crosses with no name. So when the last person in the community who knew them dies, they just are anonymous crosses in the cemetery with no name. And that's the way they live their life. It's kind of unheralded, unsung, this humility kind of thing, carried to maybe an extreme. So they think that the author of the Cloud may have been a Carthusian monk because there's no record of who wrote it. In any case, it doesn't really matter who wrote it. But what I want to do is compare a little bit the contemplative work as presented in the Cloud of Unknowing and Atma-Vichara, which is often translated self-inquiry, but I really prefer self-investigation. I think it really kind of captures more what that practice is about. So let's start with Atma-Vichara, self-investigation, and give a little synopsis. I mean, I don't have a lot of time, so obviously this is going to be a little kind of perusal of this subject. It's not going to be an in-depth thing. But I think it might whet your appetite enough that you might be interested in looking into these things for yourself and maybe see the parallels, and maybe it would help you in your practice. Because I think that if you take these two practices and kind of blend them together, they each have something to offer that kind of helps kickstart the other one. And actually, I think they're actually very much essentially the same practice, but they're from different traditions. And again, I find it so fascinating that traditions that developed on opposite sides of the globe could have essentially a very similar, in spirit, practice. So Atma-Vichara, self-investigation. A lot of people, when they hear self-inquiry, how it's usually translated, the word vichara, they think of this question, who am I? You know, and many people, I do a lot of retreats all over the country now, and even Central America and different, I'm going to Europe next year. So I talk to a lot of people about their spiritual lives and their spiritual practice. And many people seem to have this idea that self-investigation or self-inquiry is about sitting kind of quietly and asking yourself over and over again like a mantra, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? You know, but I kind of don't think that's the essence of it. At the end of my time as a monk, about 3 years, what would have been 2007 or so to 2010, I ran across this little book by Ramana Maharshi that was written down on little scraps of paper when he was keeping silence that a disciple would hand him. And, or I think the disciple actually wrote it. Or no, he couldn't have because he was keeping silence. So Ramana wrote it on little scraps of paper. Then the disciple compiled it and made a book called Who Am I? A little booklet, Nanyar in Tamil. And in that little booklet, it becomes very clear that what Ramana is talking about is not so much just asking yourself in a mantra-like fashion, who am I? But trying to trace back the I back to its source. So, and often people would ask Ramana questions, and he would, rather than answer the question in some straight way, he'd say, who's asking the question? You hear people kind of parrot that today, but I think what he was pointing to was what is essentially sentient in you that's able to ask a question. What, and he'd say, who's seeing? Who's looking? Who's asking the question? Who's driving the car? Who's right now walking down the street? You know, what is it? And what is that? It's sentience. It's beingness, you could say, that's doing all those things, or at least that's present to all those things happening, isn't it? It's what's cognizant of our human life unfolding for us. And so I think self-investigation, as I understand it, is tracing back the I thought, or the I concept even, to its source, which is this beingness, this consciousness, this sentience, this presence, that's listening to these words right now, that's looking at this person on a stage, that's sitting in a chair, that's conscious of a body sitting in a chair. To investigate that, to look at that, I think that's essentially what Atma-Vichara is. It's a kind of looking at the source of who am I, the source which is being itself. Being itself. So it's not so much in mantra-like fashion asking, who am I, as it is resting in this sense of presence, in this sense of being, in this sense of sentience, right here, right now. And that sense is always here and now. It's only here and now. And in fact, if we investigate it closely enough, we begin to understand that all there ever is here and now. And all there ever is this beingness that's not only the source of the I thought in me, but it's the source of everything that appears in this universe. It's the source of everything. You could say it's God. So Ramana was encouraging a kind of looking back at that and investigating that, just being with that, just being conscious of it. So it's consciousness being conscious of itself, you could say. And as, you know, when we do that in a kind of intentional way, that's called the practice of Atma-Vichara. When we somehow, by an act of grace, realize that that's always been present and always will be present and always is present here and now, that's realization. So the practice is in itself also the realization. It leads to the realization, and it is itself the realization. It's a lot like the Zen concept that sitting, in just sitting, shikantaza they call it, is also the end of the practice. So enlightenment, every time we sit and just sit, enlightenment is present there. Awakening, realization is present. We just don't see it, maybe. So Atma-Vichara is a very simple practice, but not easy, because it's kind of against the grain of what we normally pay attention to. It's a lot like an example that's used in traditional Advaita, and Eckhart Tolle uses this example. I use it a lot, is the space in this room. If I asked you to describe this room, you'd probably describe all the stuff in it, the chairs, the people, the walls, what's on the walls, what's on the stage, the flower, the sculpture, a person sitting in a chair. But what is this room essentially made out of? Space. And none of the things in this room could even exist without the space. The space is the ground of this room. Just like being, presence, sentience is the ground of all that is, including you and me. And Ramana was just advising, he was just suggesting, take a look at that. Check that out. Hang out with that. Just like the space in the room, it's counterintuitive. We don't notice the space in the room until we have an intention. If I say, now notice the space in the room, now suddenly you'll kind of be aware. Yeah, the room's mostly made up of space. But if I asked you just to describe the room, you probably wouldn't mention the space. That wouldn't be in the description. It'd just be all the stuff, because that's what we're generally focused on. And the same with consciousness. We're generally not focused on the ground of being. We're focused on all the things that are appearing and disappearing within it. But realization is to transcend that and to see that all those things are just appearing and disappearing in this vast, spacious awareness, which is who we really are on the deepest level. So Atma-Vichara is about investigating that, about resting in that, about intentionally turning toward that, and being that as a practice until it becomes a full realization that, yes, that's who I am, that's who I always have been. So that's the practice of Atma-Vichara. The Cloud of Unknowing starts out, I've read this book since I was 20 years old, so I've kind of interiorized it an awful lot. But at the beginning of the Cloud of Unknowing, the author makes a kind of shocking statement for a 14th century Christian monk or monastic or whatever kind he was. He says, your being is God. Sounds like a non-dual teacher, doesn't he? Your being is God. And then he talks about how being is ineffable. Being is nothing that you can define. I mean, when I say your being, when I talk about the word being, we all know what that means on some level, kind of intuitively, but you can't really define being, can you? You can't really define sentience or consciousness or presence. We're all experiencing it right now, but we'd all be very hard-pressed to give it any kind of reasonable definition. It somehow transcends any definition, and yet we know what it is. And so the author of the Cloud said, God is your being. But this being that you are, that God is, for now we'll say that God is wrapped in a cloud. It's wrapped in a cloud of unknowing. So we don't really know what it is, and yet we do know what it is. It's very paradoxical. It's very Zen-like. And the author gives this very strange metaphor or a symbol. He says, what you must do is knock upon that cloud. It's kind of a mixing of metaphors that's very odd. Have any of you ever knocked on a cloud? You know? So knock on this cloud. But then he even goes further. He says, knock on this cloud, not with your hand, but with a blind stirring of love. I love that phrase. A blind stirring of love. So it's blind, but it's a stirring, and it's love. Love of the unknown. Love of that which cannot be known on a certain level, and yet we know. Because we love. We love it. So he says, knock on this cloud with this blind stirring of love, and beneath you, put the cloud of forgetting. So he says, beneath you is this cloud of forgetting in which the whole phenomenal world, everything that exists, is beneath that cloud of forgetting. And this being, your being, which is God, is wrapped in this cloud of unknowing. So you live in this no man's or no woman's land between two clouds. One the cloud of forgetting, one the cloud of unknowing, and you knock with a blind stirring of love on the cloud of unknowing until being reveals itself. So the cloud of unknowing and the cloud of forgetting are symbols, they're archetypes, they're metaphors, or pointing to the idea of a non-conceptual stance. So we don't have concepts about phenomenal reality, we don't have concepts about spiritual reality or being, but we just allow love in our hearts to well up toward this being. And in Atma-Vichara, we also don't have a concept about the self, about who am I on the deepest level, but we do have a kind of visceral experience of that. We have a kind of a sense of that intuitively. And I think what the marriage of these two practices, which I really believe are essentially the same practice, but the contemplative prayer practice has an aspect of devotion that sometimes Atma-Vichara can lack in the ways some people practice it. It can be kind of dry. I think if you combine the two, it actually causes a spark that can set the whole thing on fire in a way that's very extraordinary and deep. Mirabai Starr was talking today in her talk about how she had a very sort of strong sense of non-duality, of oneness, how everything is unified by this being, this beingness. And yet also has a strong devotional side, a devotional heart. And I think she was saying, a lot of times people want us to make a choice. We have to choose, well, I'm a bhakti kind of person, or I'm a jnana kind of person. So I'm this sort of strident kind of clarity person that only wants the truth with no kind of emotional component. Or I'm this very devotional person that sings bhajans to God and falls in love and falls into ecstasies and so on. And she was saying that they're not mutually exclusive paths. And they never, really, if you look at the saints of any traditions, they're both. They just seamlessly fold in together. And I think that's what the Atma-Vichara practice and the contemplative activity found in the Cloud of Unknowing or contemplative prayer kind of blended together brings some strength to the other. That really makes it a very potent practice. And that's kind of what I teach, like with my students. I kind of blend those things. So you can investigate the self, we can look at presence, we can look at beingness within us, as the kind of the ground of our sense of self, what precedes any kind of less deep sense of ourself, based on identity, on the body, on role, on function, on personality, on all those things. But there's a source of that we can trace back, we can get to. And we can look at it with a kind of blind stirring of love. We can investigate it lovingly. To investigate it lovingly. So it melds this devotional quality with this kind of precise clarity quality. And I think together, you've got an opening of both the head and the heart, which I think is necessary for a really kind of balanced, comprehensive realization of truth. So I'm very struck by the fact that this is so short and I can't really go as deeply into this as I'd like to. I do on retreats sometimes. I actually do talk about the Cloud of Unknowing and go into it more deeply. But this being such a short thing, I could at least give you a little taste, but I would encourage you to read the book Nan-Yar, the little booklet. It's really just a booklet. It's very brief. Nan-Yar, Who Am I? In Tamil, it's called Nan-Yar, by Ramana Maharshi. There's another book called, I had that in my mind now. What is it? You interviewed him, Rick. Michael James. The book is called, it's a book about the teaching of Ramana, self-inquiry. It's called something in the Art of Being. What is it? Does anybody know? Anybody here? Do you remember the name of that book? Huh? Happiness and the Art. Thank you, Tomer. A good student of mine, Tomer. Happiness and the Art of Being by Michael James. That book has a beautiful, beautiful explanation of Atma-Vichara. Very deep and very comprehensive. And he actually was a student of Sri Sadhu Am, who was a direct disciple of Ramana Maharshi, who awoke in the presence of Ramana Maharshi. So it's really a very pure teaching lineage back to Ramana Maharshi. And I would highly recommend those books for the Atma-Vichara. And for the Cloud of Unknowing, I would recommend the Cloud of Unknowing. There's an image edition of that was translated by William Johnson, S.J., Society of Jesus, who lived in Tokyo for many years and studied Zen and went very deeply into that tradition, but was an expert on the Cloud of Unknowing and did a great translation in modern, because it was in Middle English. So he did a great translation into modern English and also with a great commentary. So I would just recommend just contemplatively reading those two sources and seeing the connections that come together for you in your own heart. I think those practices are essentially very, very similar, but they each bring something to the table that kind of completes the other one in a way that rounds it out in a way that I think together could really kickstart something in you that could maybe grow into a beautiful sense of clarity and realization. So I would really encourage you, if you feel at all inclined, to look into those sources. And I'd like to just leave some time for some questions. So how much time do we have left now? 10 minutes is good, yeah. That was exactly what I had in mind. So now we have 10 minutes. So if there are any questions about either of these things or really about anything, anything's fair game. Yes, Mark.
How do you get any feeling going for a formless reality that you've never experienced? You know what I mean? I appreciate the bhakti approach, the devotional approach, but trying to imagine how I would actually do it. Like, what does it sound like? I mean, what does it feel like? How would it go? What's that to?
He talks about a blind stirring of love, and believe it or not, I know this sounds kind of like a non-answer, but somehow when you sit quietly and just rest in a sense of being, there is a blind stirring of love that arises. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Trust me on this. If you sit quietly with an intention of resting in your sense of presence, sentience, being, there's some sort of innate quality of love. And I think that's what that's pointing to. And that in itself is a kind of realization, just that, wow, there's this aspect of my heart that just loves this sense of presence, just this being right here, right now, with no concepts, wrapped in this cloud of unknowing, and yet there's this kind of knocking on it with this blind stirring. And I know that sounds strange and counterintuitive, but try it and see for yourself.
What do you think of Bhajan's songs too?
Oh, I love those.
That might help to generate.
Yeah. I'm doing more singing in my retreats. I'm an old singer, so I used to sing a lot, and I'm coming up with, I both do like Christian sort of chorus type songs that I got from Taizé community, which is a monastic community in France. It's an ecumenical community, and they have very beautiful, simple choruses that are very kind of Bhajan style, and they're in all different languages, in French, English, Spanish, Italian, Latin, all kinds of things. And then sometimes some Bhajan stuff. And there's one that I do that you could, maybe we could just do it, it'd be fun. And it's based on a Hindu bhajan to Shiva, but you change it to Christaya instead of Shivaya. And, but really, essentially the energy of Shiva and the energy of Christ, it's the same energy. It's the same as these two practices. They're from, developed at other opposite ends of the planet, and yet they're pointing to the same energy, the same presence. So this little ditty goes like this, some of you probably heard it with Shiva. Today we'll do Christaya, but hopefully that won't offend anybody. But it goes like this: Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya. Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya. You can Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya. Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya. Om Namah Christaya, Om Namah Christaya. So, I do these kind of things on my retreats now. I try to put a little devotional stuff in there, because really, and with students I work with, devotion is part of this whole thing. It's not just this dry, clinical, philosophical sort of parsing out of reality, The heart has to engage, the heart, So I think it's important. Yes?
It reminds me of something else Ramana taught, which was just basically surrender.
Yes. Absolutely. I really think that even meditation practice, what I teach with people I work with on a regular basis, is a kind of 3-level approach to practice. And those of you who follow me on Facebook and my website and stuff, you know all this, but just for those of you who don't. And it's basically a contemplative practice or a meditative practice, which is very much along the lines of this Atma-Vichara, or the contemplative practice found in a cloud of unknowing, a resting in a sense of presence in a silent kind of meditative way, and then surrender, and then service. So I think all those practices actually point back to a realization of this presence, this ground of beingness, that fills the whole universe, that fills the entire cosmos, that is the essence of everything that we see appearing and disappearing in this phenomenal kind of dream that we're in. So I really do really stress surrender. I actually think meditation practice is kind of a preparation for surrender. My sense is that surrender is the main practice. Because most of our lives are not lived on a meditation cushion in a quiet monastery, even when you live in a quiet monastery. Most of your lives are lived in the hurly-burly of everyday life. And surrender is essentially the same as meditation, because it's sinking back into that sense of presence, into that consciousness that doesn't judge, that doesn't grab on and cling, that doesn't push away, but that's simply present to whatever arises, that's simply present to whatever goes. And that's what surrender is. The only difference is the context. Meditation's in the context of a quiet room sitting on a cushion. Surrender's in the context of a traffic jam, or your boss yelling at you, or whatever. You name your poison. So, yes.
So were you essentially surrendering to this awareness without objects? Is that what you mean by presence? I mean, because it's difficult for me to understand what sinking into being means, but it makes more sense for me to be like in a non-dual state, or like just aware.
When I say sinking into being, I mean just recognizing that beingness, presence, sentience that's just conscious here and now is always present. That's what I mean by sinking into it, or intending toward that, or just intending to look at that. It's always present. It's present in every single person in this room, And it's the same presence. It's not present in you as your presence and present in me as my presence. It's the same presence. It's just being. It's just presence. It's just sentience. And it's so simple that it seems complicated. But it's simple but not easy, as they say, because it's a little counterintuitive. Like I say, it's not normally what we pay attention to. Does that make some sense? Or?
Like when I've got to a point with my self-inquiry practice that I can see that there's no seer in the seeing. And when I hear things, there's no hearer. There's just the hearing, right? And so in that sense, there's no object in awareness, in me observing that. But I don't know if that's the same as what you're saying.
That sounds a little conceptual. I would say it's more just a matter of just experientially being here and now. It's just really simple. It doesn't have to even have like words attached to it, that there's seen but no seer or all that. I mean, that's true in a way, but what I'm talking about is a more kind of existential, experiential, that's what I mean by sinking into that. Just kind of letting that just reveal itself, letting the reality of that just be. That's the way it is. I mean, right now, all there is you're hearing something, you're seeing things. What is it that's behind? Go back to the source. What is it that's seeing? What is it that's hearing? And there's no answer to that question. It's pointing to a resting in something. It's pointing to a kind of sense of that just being present. Does that make sense? Not so much a kind of conceptual sort of verbal thing in the mind of this is what that is, but more of an experiential. I don't know if that makes some sense, but
It has to have some relationship to not resisting the present moment or what is.
mm-hmm.
Surrender has to have some relationship to that,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Any other questions? Yes.
I think Ramana also talked about the reason you're having a problem is because of I thought not being isolated and deprived of its identity. And that kind of helps for me because this I, the sense of being the doer, is what needs to be surrendered. And when you look at it carefully, you discover that this thought is just a little thought bubble that's not real. It doesn't, it in of itself is insentient. And therefore, it cannot control its surroundings in the way that we think that it can. So the sense of bringing something with us, the sense of doership, is surrender. Does that make sense?
Not really. Not to me. What I'm pointing to is something much more just visceral, Just not without any kind of concept about a doer or a non-doer or anything. Just that there's a consciousness that's simply aware of whatever arises. It's aware of whatever ceases. It's just awareness itself. I'm not trying to disparage what you're saying, and I'm sure it has a truth on a certain level. But what I'm talking about is more of a direct experience of just being right here, right now. Not with any kind of philosophy connected to it, not with any kind of doer or non-doer or anything like that. Just the reality of being that's, what is it that's hearing this voice? What is it that's seeing through your eyes? There's a consciousness. Right now, just everybody look around the room and be aware that there's an awareness that's looking through your eyes right now. There's an awareness that right now is aware of seeing, right? Can you get a sense of that? It's a very simple reality. Now close your eyes. That consciousness is still here. It's just not looking through your eyes right now. That's what I'm pointing to. That's Atma-Vichara, looking at that. Not with any overlay of any kind of Advaita philosophy or anything about a doer or not doer or anything. Just that experience. And that experience will reveal itself. It will somehow become more clear in your experience. Yeah, Jeannie.
And that's where this real perfume of love is really becomes incredibly palpable, because that is looking or is experiencing isn't vacant in any way.
Absolutely.
It's full of love.
Love is just a word, of course, and a lot of people have difficulties with the word because they associate, but that's absolutely accurate. I mean, what we find, like Mark's question about, well, how do I stir up love for this sort of non-conceptual sense of being? But the reality is that if we're just quiet, if we're just present, what we find is conscious, is all-embracing. It's unconditionally open to everything that arises. It's unconditionally open to every arrival, to every departure. And that's another name for love. That's kind of another way of describing love. That seems to be the essence of this reality. In the Hindu understanding of things, they talk about Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. Ananda, the bliss element, is often also translated love, because it's just unconditionally open. And that is happiness, that is peace, that is love. In the Christian understanding, the mystical tradition, they talk about the fruit of the Spirit. And it's not like there's all these separate fruit of the Spirit. I'll just list them and just feel the energy of it. And when you go through this list, they're all really the same reality. They're not separate qualities. Even Satchit Ananda, that's why they make it into one word. It's just one reality. And the fruit of the Spirit in the Christian mystical tradition is love. Let's feel it. Don't just hear the words, but feel the energy of it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness. They're not separate things. This beingness, this consciousness, this pure awareness is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Do you feel, can you feel that sense? Yeah. That's what I think Atma-Vichara is pointing to. That's what the contemplative practice in the Cloud of Unknowing is pointing to. That's what I hope to point to. Not just with my words, but with my life, with my very being. And I'll just leave you with one little saying of St. Francis of Assisi. He says, who I'm named after. He says, preach the gospel wherever you go. If necessary, use words.